Hi, everybody. Welcome to the SANS OSINT Plus live stream. I'm your host, Micah Hoffman. I go by Web Breacher online, and I am thrilled to be here with some of my colleagues, and I can't wait for this discussion. I've literally been waiting for this for over a month, and it's so exciting to me because today, on the OSINT Plus live stream, we're going to be talking about how open source intelligence works with and augments the digital forensic and incident response field. And for that, I have brought together three people here that are going to help us talk about that. Why don't we start out with some introductions? Mari, you want to tell us who you are?
Sure. Yes, my name is Mari DeGrazia. I know it has an I there, but it is Mari, not Mari. I am a SANS instructor where I teach digital forensics and incident response. I'm also an associate managing director at Kroll Cybersecurity, where I lead a team of investigators through various breaches that occur, especially right now. Ransomware is really huge, especially with COVID and everybody working remotely. I've also been a technical editor on several books dealing with Windows registry and Windows forensic analysis. I've been in the industry for well over a decade and specializing in IT for 20 years and digital forensics for a decade now. So hello, everybody.
Thanks for being on the show, Mari. I appreciate you taking the time out of your very big, busy schedule. Lodrina, why don't you say hi and tell us about yourself?
Yeah, hello everybody. I'm Lodrina Cherne. I also teach forensics, and I, in my day job, work at Cybersecurity on our security team. So making sure that everything that I teach in the forensic world can be implemented at a business level. And beyond that, I have lots of other interests in policy, in protecting people online, and I'm excited to be here with you all.
And we're excited to have you here, Lodrina. Thank you so much for joining us. And last but certainly not least, Mr. Lomas. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, Jeff?
Thanks, Micah. Hey, I'm Jeff Lomas. I work for law enforcement right now for a major metropolitan police department who is gracious enough to let me teach for SANS. I teach open source intelligence for SANS, a 6-day course. And then I do a lot of different things on the side. I have a forensic background, so been in law enforcement for a little over 13 years, 14 years, I think now. And I've been doing investigations that entire time. And I've been doing OSINT this entire time. Halfway through my law enforcement career, I got involved in digital forensics. Had an amazing opportunity to be trained in vehicle forensics, computer forensics, mobile forensics. And so once I got that experience, I started digging deeper down into things and found out I was actually doing open source intelligence the entire time. So other things that I do, I also teach at university level. I developed a course. It's called it's a course in basically advanced mobile forensics and IoT forensics and how those two things go together. So I still stay involved in forensics, but I do heavily right now involving investigations involving money laundering, things on the law enforcement side where Mari said we're the ransomware issue that we're having right now. So a lot of cryptocurrency tracing. So just a little bit of everything. And so that's why I'm really excited to be on here today with you, Micah, because everything we're talking about is going to be very pertinent.
Yeah, absolutely. And open source intelligence and the open source intelligence world, or OSINT as we call it, has really blossomed in the past bunch of years. Myself, I am the president of the OSINT Curious Project, which is a non-for-profit organization that shares free information through blog posts, live streams, and other recorded snippets about how to do open source intelligence, how to do gathering and analysis of data that's out there, and really how to just move forward. Also am the author of the SANS Sec 47 class, which is an open source intelligence class. And I do a bunch of other things too. But let's talk just briefly about how this conversation is going to go. First off, welcome to all of our wonderful listeners that are coming to us live from LinkedIn, YouTube, and the Twitter platforms. We are enjoying watching all of the comments that you're pasting into the live stream chats. There are hundreds, if not thousands of you out there. So if we don't mention whatever you put in your chat, on air, please be patient with us. We'll try to get through all of those comments and questions and all, and we want you to send them. We want you to be a part of this conversation. So on whatever platform you're on and watching this, please send us some chats with questions that you have for our guests about OSINT or about digital forensics. But first, I thought it might be nice just to kind of set the stage and define what we do for the two very different audiences, the digital forensics and the OSINT audiences. So, Lodrina, would you mind sharing some of the digital forensics things that people do when you're in that field?
Absolutely. So just to level set for those of you who are completely new to forensics, we might be tossing around the term DFIR or DFIR, or you might see that scrolling down on your screen. And we're talking about digital forensics and incident response. And there's a lot of different definitions I could give, but I think one that's particularly relevant for this audience is I'm trying to find information that's relevant on a computer. So that's my specialty that I work in, is dead disk, offline forensics, looking at computers, looking at cell phones to figure out what happened there after the fact. So that's what I do, but the reason it's so important and the reason that I love doing it is the ability to tell a story about what happened. So, you know, in the class that I teach, we could be talking about how there was interaction with a shell bag at this date and time. And those of you who are familiar with the field, you go, oh yeah, I know all about that. And I know what shell bags are and why it's important. But the thing is, for everybody else out there that sounds like Greek to, the thing that I get to pull out of that is to share that, well, I have a computer that I'm investigating, and this is really the specialty that I work in, that I've worked in for over a decade, is to look at a computer and say, the person who used this computer was interacting with certain files and folders at this time. Here are the names of them, and here's why I think that they might be relevant to this case. So it's storytelling, it's finding a needle in a haystack, and for me, doing it at a really, really low level technically, and then being able to extrapolate and tell somebody why it's important and why it matters, that's kind of big picture what digital forensics is for me.
All right, and Lo, you said that you work with dead computers. So essentially, you have a computer, you're taking out that hard drive or whatever other media is in there, you're analyzing that to put together that picture. Was that accurate?
Exactly.
Okay. Mari, do you work or do you have experience with other types of forensics or incident response?
I do, and Lorinda definitely hit on what we call like dead box forensics, or what we kind of term in the industry like autopsy, right? Because it's dead in that sense that it's not a live system. But here at Kroll, we use in our investigation something called Carbon Black, which is an endpoint threat monitoring solution that in our investigations, we push these out throughout the entire environment. So typically, a typical case nowadays, for instance, would be a ransomware case. So we deploy this endpoint onto all of the systems in the network, and we start pulling telemetry from them, running processes, things that are running on the system. So, and then we also leverage this to pull back artifacts. So instead of having a hard drive to kind of attach to a write blocker and pull data from, we pull it back from the live system. But from that perspective moving forward, it's very similar to the dead box forensics because we're looking at the artifacts kind of in a historical sense. So a lot of times with these ransomware cases, the threat actors have been in the environment for a while. So we need to track back, how they got into the environment, what happened. And a lot of times we're, doing things like log analysis or looking at registry hives to see, like Lorinda mentioned, what they did while they were on the system so that we can then help the client through this to determine, how they got in, what data did they access, what did they do while they were in the environment, and did they leave any back doors? So although you think you've eradicated them, we want to make sure that they're not going to be able to get back into that environment. We don't just work ransomware cases. A lot of this applies to other types of threats out there as well. That just happens to be the real prevalent one out there right now that's going on.
Yeah, it is absolutely relevant. And I love that you and Lodrina and even Jeff have different experiences within forensics, because Jeff, you have done a whole bunch with mobile forensics, right? With people's phones. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's correct. So I work in the law enforcement space. So my experiences are going to be very different than maybe Mary or Lodrina have, because it's just the world that we live in. So the expectations, the things that I might be looking for are different than maybe the things that Mary and Lodrina might be looking for different reasons. So, Mary mentioned that she's looking to stop people from coming back into a network. I don't have a role in that. I have a role of trying to find the people that are on the outside once they've already done these things. So the things they're looking for are different in that aspect. So depending on the mobile forensic device, whether it's mobile forensics or computers you're looking for a complete different set of artifacts, and you're looking at them for complete different reasons. So when I started in forensics many moons ago, we were trained in computer forensics, because that was 90% of what we did in law enforcement was computer forensics, and the caseload was very low. Fast forward to even maybe just 2 years ago, now it's completely flipped itself. So mobile forensics was around 10%, computer forensics was 90%. Now it's 90% mobile, 10%, maybe less than 10% computers. And now we have to delve into these other devices, such as IoT devices and vehicle forensics and all these other things that we never even thought were going to be a thing maybe 4 years, maybe 3 years ago. Sure. So the landscape has changed, and I've noticed that the need for understanding both sides, so understanding what Mary and Lodrina do, and then understanding what we do here in law enforcement, very important. And then to bring in those skills from the outside. So Mary's probably more into these things where when you're working at Kroll, you're looking at attribution side of it. So it's because ultimately these ransomware investigations are just multinational, worldwide, sometimes multi-year investigations that take specialists from each individual place. So somebody like Lodrina going into a computer in a dead box, finding a particular artifact, passing it on to somebody in Mary's position where she's looking at more network stuff, combining that, and then what do we do from there? From an OSINT perspective, Micah, that there's a lot of signals out there that we can pick up, depending on if the attacker has some sort of infrastructure set up, and then we start to get into linking things together, and then sometimes that goes back to the Lodrinas of the world, where we go back and go, hey, did you find this one thing in there? And then she's like, indeed we did. And so if we have that communication, we can get to those answers quicker.
Well, I love what you just said there, Jeff, because really, if we can simplify it, like vastly oversimplify open source intelligence, it's about using, in our case, the internet to find things, to research a topic, and then grab that augmented data and use it to answer some kind of a question. So I'd be interested in hearing from Mary or Lodrina about, what are those I think, Mary, you mentioned artifacts that you're pulling back. What are those pieces of data that you're pulling off of networks and systems that possibly have been compromised that you're then looking online to research?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have this kind of interesting situation that happened. A lot of times in cases, unfortunately, a third-party vendor might be compromised. And then from that third-party vendor, like an IT company, the attackers will compromise the IT vendor. And then from there, they'll go out to like all of their clients because they've compromised those credentials. So we were working a case for a client, and I had noticed that an account had been created on a system. And one of the artifacts we use to pull this information is what's called the SAM hive, which tells us local accounts that have been created on a computer. And I noticed the naming convention was a little bit different than what was in the client's environment. And I was like, this is interesting. So I just Googled the first and the last name associated with it, and it led me to their IT vendor, which they hadn't mentioned on the call yet, because sometimes you have internal IT, you have external IT, and next thing I know, I'm looking at this LinkedIn profile, the name matches, it's an IT vendor in the same state, and I'm like, wait a minute. So I go back to our client, and I'm like, here I found this IT vendor. Could you let me know if you work with them or if you've worked with them in the past? And so they're like, oh, yeah, that is an IT vendor. They claim that they didn't have remote access into our systems. And I'm like, well,
Let's talk about that.
Let's talk about that. So that was just an instance where, I was just able to take something I found through my analysis that looked interesting. It looked different than what I was seeing in the client environment. So it stood out to me. I did some research, found the LinkedIn profile, and kind of made all of those connections, and then took what I found back to the client and found out, that ended up being a really important puzzle in how the attackers got into the environment was through that third-party vendor.
That's interesting, Mary, because that investigative path, and then taking that final product of, hey, here's all the data I found, and taking that to your customer. That's what we do in open source intelligence. We have something that we're researching. We find the data, we analyze it, we create the final report, that intelligence, and we then give it to our customer, which then says they shouldn't have had access, but they did. Wow. Lo, do you have a story, an anecdote, or can you just describe some of the things that you might find on a hard drive that's not currently spinning that you might research online?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the investigations that I end up doing relate to intellectual property theft. Okay. So a lot of white-collar crime, potentially. And one of the stories that comes to mind is very typical of a lot of work that I do. But one woman I was investigating, who was a salesperson at a company in Colorado, went on vacation for a week, came back from vacation, gave her notice, and there were just some suspicious terms around her departure. So what happened is I got her old corporate laptop and was asked to investigate, do you know what's going on here? We think she might have gone to a competitor, and we're really concerned because of her status in the company that she might have taken some clients with her. So knowing kind of the timeline that was involved, I was able to look at the system, and like Mary was mentioning, different artifacts that you would be examining in the registry hive. Well, there are other artifacts in the registry that I examined related to what Wi-Fi network she was connected to. So during this vacation time, I started to see this story of her traveling to San Diego, connecting to a hotel Wi-Fi in San Diego, and then all of a sudden, within 24 hours, connecting to the Wi-Fi that was named after this company's biggest competitor. Oh. So you start to figure out after the fact, holy crap, this woman was interviewing for a competitor while she was on vacation, but took her corporate laptop over to the competitor and then started correlating different artifacts from internet browsing activity and downloads, realizing, again, this involves no secret camera looking over her shoulder, but figuring out through OSINT techniques, and just logic, that she had gone into her company's Salesforce database, downloaded the customer database while she was at the competitor. And, well, I don't really know the end of the story, but after bringing that information forward, the technical information starts to tell a really interesting story.
Yeah. Well, and that's interesting the way that you bring it together, because I have a feeling, were you able to find the Wi-Fi network name of the competitor using maybe like Weigel.net or some online resource like that?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you mentioned that, and I've always thought of that site as Wiggle.
I thought it was really Wiggle too, but it's like Wi-Fi. So I've changed it, and it's only one G too. So like two G's would be Wiggle. I don't know. Mary, Jeff, what do you think? Wiggle or Weigel?
I thought it was Wiggle, but I think your logic makes sense.
I'm disagreeing with your logic, and it is Wiggle. I have spoken.
Okay. All right. We need a wireless expert on here. Lo, what were you saying?
Okay, so anyway, for those of you playing along at home, if you want to check out Wiggle with one G, that's a site where you can find out information about wireless networks all over the world. And, this is something where all of these investigations we're talking about, whether it's looking at a wireless network that for me is across the country, I'm based in Boston, Massachusetts, or whether you're tracking an attacker who's currently live and in a system, The level of detail that we're going to all go to in these investigations all depends on context. So if I was looking at, the salesperson in a multi-million-dollar lawsuit, I'm probably going to send somebody to San Diego to go to that hotel room and just confirm this is the Wi-Fi signal we're getting, and then go to the lobby of the competitor and confirm, yep, this is their Wi-Fi name and here it is. But when you're in that live attacker scenario, or maybe you're investigating a missing person and they've left their cell phone behind and you need to get into it, you're going to be talking about completely different levels of investigation and scope.
Well, and also resources too, because in an OSINT investigation, there's very few chances of me sending somebody out remotely to verify and validate the bits. I know, Jeff, you have some experience with that because, well, you're law enforcement, and a lot of the things that you do for local crime or to research local events, you may be able to go out and replicate, right? I mean, you wrote a blog post for us in Curious about extracting wireless data and cell data from a phone and mapping.
Right. And so, so to build off of what Lodrina just said about, pulling Wi-Fi devices, absolutely, we can do those things. And it's important for the examiner to, like Lodrina did, to recognize that right away. Because what she's just done is she's cut out the process where the investigator, the person who's going to look at the data, is going to look at that and come back to somebody else and ask somebody else. Lodrina's just sped that up. And so within law enforcement, so, I'm working in, what we coined as real-time forensics, where somebody in the chat asked about, how do we acquire phones and not, compromise the data? Well, there's a forensic process to that, but sometimes, depending if it's life or death, you might have a missing person, you might think that might be in trouble or something like that. You bypass some of these things to get to the answers quicker to save lives. So I'll post I don't know if I'll post it in the private chat so you guys can do the post it to the rest of the group. But basically, my technique was just born out of necessity. So I was examining a cell phone one day, an Android cell phone, and I found a database, and I found a bunch of numbers, MCCs and MNCs, and I didn't know what these numbers were. So I just got curious and I started Googling stuff and looking around, and I found databases that I started making sense of what these were. Now, these are cell towers, so is there any way for me to really verify these things? Very difficult unless you have some very specialized equipment. But like anything else in intelligence, we have to make sure that we're doing something from a confidence level. So in the case I used it on was someone who had committed a crime and then driven across state lines. And along as they were doing that, they were also had some web browser activity. So they were Googling things like, hey, what's a good country for that doesn't follow extradition laws of the United States? And they just happened to be driving another state. And eventually they came back, but that cell phone tower log came all the way back to here because, they had turned around and they, contacted somebody and came back around. But now we have an entire story to tell. Like Lodrina was saying, we're telling a story now. We're telling it both from OSINT techniques, so we can make things like KMLs. We can make map files out of this data that we find in the phones. We can put it together so people can make sense of it. So, what Lodrina was saying was that, she put this information together. She doesn't really know how the investigation turns out because she's doing her part. But the part that she's doing is she's creating that timeline for other people that they're going to start filling in the timelines with things that they know. And in any investigation, I think we talk about this all the time. And OSINT isn't the end all be all. It's an enhancement. It's an enhancement on anything.
It is the end all be all. I take offense. We're done with this live stream right now.
That's it. We're out of here.
Yeah,
no, it's an enhancement. So it's an enhancement on digital forensics. It's an enhancement on any investigation. So we have this situation where if you have the opportunity, like Lodrina did, then you'd want to help out the best you can with, staying within your job role, and then, passing it on to the next person that they can use that. Okay.
And that's fair enough. Lo, you mentioned something earlier about, well, I wrote it down, essentially about when you're starting an investigation, you get a piece of hardware with a little story attached to it, right? Like, hey, this laptop is from a person that has done something that we think is not above board. Does that influence what you're looking for and how you look on the laptop? Or you take that information and you're like, all right, I understand that that's what you're looking for. I'm going to do my complete assessment and let me see where the data takes me. What is your approach when you're doing your forensics?
Yeah, so hopefully I get a story attached with a piece
Okay.
of hardware or a data source. And if I
Doesn't
don't,
happen all the time.
the first thing I'm going to do if I don't is I'm going to ask you, what is this case about? Because again, that missing child is going to be a different priority, is going to involve different artifacts and different data sources than say maybe somebody stole a couple customer lists last month, I'm not really sure. So I think the first thing to know is that the field of forensics is so broad. Between us all, we haven't even talked about reverse engineering malware or network analysis or the cloud. And probably the best thing that I want to share about kicking off a case is to dispel the notion that there's the idea of full forensics. Okay. So there is almost no way to put your eyeballs on every piece of data in a case. And I think that's really important to share.
So full forensic is knowing everything about what goes on based upon the hardware and forensics techniques. Would that be fair to say?
I would say full forensics, as it gets thrown around that I've heard, with colleagues or in the news, is something that almost doesn't really exist. In some really high-profile cases, if you have a large team of analysts working on a case, I can think of maybe once in my career where I've been told, look at everything you can on the system, turn over every rock, do as much analysis as you can, starting over here, and then keep going until you feel like you've looked at everything. Only once in my career. And, when I talk about that timeline of keep going, we never really got to the end. It's just not plausible.
Mary, do you have similar experiences, or because I know that you work in totally different situations?
Yeah, no, I would agree with Lorinda. A lot of times, too, we think about our client's budget that comes to mind, right? We can't overturn every rock. Sometimes something, too, that might be interesting for one type of investigation isn't applicable. So maybe I'm working a ransomware case and I happen to be looking through internet history because I know the threat actor used it to download malware. And at that same time, maybe I see that person accessing, some adult websites, which they're not supposed to be doing at work. That's out of the scope of my investigation. But if I were working, maybe an HR case where that's relevant, then I would want to go down that rabbit hole, find out, what sites they visited. But because I'm focused on my ransomware investigation, that goes on the back burner. As interesting as it may be to pursue that, I have to let that go. Okay. I might pass on to the client, hey, we saw some of this activity. It might not be safe because it could lead to malware being downloaded on the system, but that's not a priority in the investigation. There is so much information that gets tracked on a computer that you really need to focus in on the analysis that you're going to be doing, because as Lodrina said, there's just so much on a computer that you can take a look at, that you could spend hours and hours and hours doing it. You could go back, 2 or 3 years looking at information, and typically there is some kind of end goal in mind, a question that you're trying to answer. And it is digital forensics. So we do have this concept of the scientific method. We have a query, we have a question, we formulate a plan to attack that, and we go through a process to see, are we able to answer that question? So I would definitely agree with her that if someone said, here's the computer, go find everything, I'd be like, what's your budget? And it's going to take a lot of time.
Okay, and we're working time and materials here. Yes. Well, and that's an important thing. You mentioned like the keyword of process, which I would imagine that let me ask you, do your cases go to court? Any of you? I mean, Jeff, I would imagine your cases probably go to court. Mary shaking her head low. Do your cases usually go to court? Maybe they can't.
They can. I would say more often than not, they'll get resolved before.
Okay. And so, Jeff, let me just pick your brain here. You as somebody in the OSINT world, you as somebody in DFIR, we've had some questions in the comments over here in the live stream about OSINT techniques being used and how they might not be accessible and admissible in court. Can you tell us a little bit about your experiences with OSINT and in court?
Well, so let's start from being classically trained in digital forensics, like Mari and Lodrina and myself. And so Mari and Lodrina do it all the time. And so me personally, I can't think of a better person to collect forensic information. So when we say the word forensic, that word gets thrown around. Digital forensics is nothing like a forensic process, say like in DNA or something.
Okay.
When we say forensic, we mean for court. That's literally what it means. It's evidence for court. So if I'm collecting something from the internet, of course, if I just grab a screenshot of something, it's very easy to possibly to disprove what somebody had done. However, we know that in the OSINT world that has gone towards this digital forensic model where we're not just grabbing screenshots. So sometimes that's all we can do. But there's times when we are grabbing entire web pages, or we're grabbing domain information, and we're documenting the time that we got those things. If we're grabbing a web page, we're hashing those things. So we're using a cryptographic algorithm that basically gives a digital fingerprint to the web page, just like we would to a cell phone image that we retrieved, just like Lodrina would do when she puts a hard drive. It takes a hard drive out of the system and images it, and then develops a hash from that. It's the same principle. So that, let's say I do all this work, I pull a page to say, bad guy was using a malicious phishing page or something. I do a warrant on that, and I send it off to whatever company, and I find out that indeed it was them. Since then they've deleted it and taken it down. I now have, because I grabbed that the first time I saw it, Mari knows this about the way the internet works now, things just disappear very quickly. We have to grab them while they're here. So grabbing that, that hash, taking that web page, developing that hash, having a date along with it, saying at this date and time I grabbed that. That is absolutely admissible in court, and I've had it admissible in court before. I'll say this about admissibility in court. It comes down to your training. So if I weren't trained in both digital forensics and OSINT, I don't know how comfortable I would be explaining, the situation I told you with the cell phone tower data. Each state is different here in the U.S. I can't speak for international courts, but in our state, I have to be re-qualified as an expert every single time I go to the stand. So I sit there and I give the long form version of the introduction here, where I say, hey, I do all these things, and I teach here, and I do this, and I do that. And then at the end, they go, okay, fine, you're an expert. And then I get to give not just my opinion on something, but I can show my findings, and the things that I say and the data that I have presented beforehand become admissible in court because of those reasons.
Okay. So all it takes to become an expert is going to court, right? I mean, that's what I took away from what you said is.
Yeah, if the judge says you are, then you are. Yeah.
Excellent. Cool. So let me just oversimplify something here, and let me ask, when you have to research something, do you use things aside from Google, or Lo, you mentioned using specialized resources like Weigel, but is your go-to just Googling it, maybe with some extra search operators and all to research things? What are your thoughts?
A little secret sauce to find the needle in the haystack. Yeah, that is one of my favorite things to do, is finding obscure resources. But I'd say not just through Googling.
Okay.
A lot of times so the classes that Mari and I teach for Windows forensics, I like to share when I'm talking about Windows upgrading. And today there's a lot of talk about the new Windows 11 coming out, and how's that going to work, and how does that change for forensics? Well, every new device or every new operating system that comes out, there's no correlating manual that says, here's all of your forensic artifacts, on a silver plate. We have to not just research through Google, through technical documentation for different systems. So I'm thinking about Windows TechNet, that I know I have really had trouble Googling. Those search results I don't really find on Google. I need to go into Microsoft and TechNet and search for those resources when I'm looking up really obscure things. But also a lot of testing. And Jeff mentioned earlier, the scientific method. So it's all over the place.
Okay. Mary, and similar things? I mean, you're looking for different things for different purposes. What are you doing when you're researching online?
Yeah, absolutely. I think white papers are pretty huge. A lot of times we will find information in white papers as it relates. Of course, we kind of use Google to leverage that, but sometimes you do have to sign into these services, subscribe to them. But for forensic artifacts, there's a lot of people out there that do a lot of research and they publish those white papers. Sometimes just reaching out to authors directly as well about research they've done or questions that you may have. But yeah, Google does tend to be my go-to. I always wonder if Google went down, what would I do, right? Like they say for programmers, when what's the big code rehab goes down? Overstack. When Overstack goes down,
Stack
right?
Overflow.
It's like all the programmers go out and grab lunch for a while.
So, Mary, you were mentioning about white papers. I think that dovetails with what Lo was saying, that you need to understand how systems work, you have to like jack into the matrix to learn everything you can about event code 30210 or whatever. And so those white papers really come into play there, right? Understanding your systems.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, testing, research, and then turning around and sharing those results with the community so that other people can benefit from your work as well.
Okay, cool. So let's shift now, because I'm an instructor. In fact, all of us are instructors here. I remember times in classes where I have students that ask questions about those wonderful Hollywood moments where they're like, okay, Micah, when are you going to get to teach us about that time on CSI Cyber when the person was located by their cell phone's IP address and we saw the satellite images zoom in and they just went and they grabbed them? When are we going to learn about that kind of OSINT? And I'm like, go watch the movie to the TV, because that doesn't happen. Is that in forensics as well? I mean, do they have these type of Hollywood sensational let's enhance?
Oh yeah, I think my favorite is like when they clone an entire hard drive like wirelessly in like 5 minutes. I'm like, that never
Nice.
that never happened. Or when investigators just show up at the scene and they just immediately start logging into the computer and looking at the search history. Oh, this is the last place they went to in their internet history. There's a process for all of this, and that makes me shudder when that happens. I think there are definitely certain situations where it would warrant that. Jeff, you could probably speak a little bit more to that, like missing persons case. But a lot of times, I think there was a question earlier on, how do you analyze a hard drive without making any changes to it? And we have to, there are a couple of ways we attach it to what's called a write blocker, which keeps us from making any changes to the hard drive. And then by using the write blocker, we can also create what's called a forensic image, which is a bit-by-bit image. And for a standard hard drive today, like a 1 terabyte drive will take 4 to maybe 5 hours for us to get that image of it. So these situations where they clone it wirelessly in a matter of minutes, it makes me chuckle.
Jeff, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, Mary's right. I mean, depending on what it is you're looking for, and time is of the essence, like she said before. So it could take a very long time we're talking about, dealing with mobile forensics. You're talking sometimes hours to download phones, and vendors such as Celebrite, they have changed their model a little bit to start looking at things we might be able to cherry pick from the phones. So let's say we just want to look for internet history. Let's say you have somebody in custody that is going to be let go pretty soon, and that they were, somebody thought they might have been radicalized through some terror organization, and they want to say, hey, we want to know what this person's YouTube history looks like. And so how do you do that quickly? Do you wait hours for the phone and then he's already out and then they go do something bad? Or do you cherry pick that information, you get the YouTube, you get the the YouTube history, you put that through something like YouTube DL, which is another thing that I've done to show, combing through information faster, and then get it that way, because those YouTube videos are not going to be resident on the phone. Maybe a couple snippets will be available on the phone and through cache or something, but then you won't be able to tell. So how do you get those things really quickly? And that's really what this has come down to in a real-time forensic situation, is getting the information faster. And again, I can't think of anyone more qualified to do that than someone who's been traditionally trained in digital forensics, or at least has that base. So to be able to go out and grab all that video. So, you go out to and you find all these, you have 90 YouTube videos they watched in the last 3 weeks. Not uncommon. That's probably light. And then how do you go through that really quickly? And you can do some keyword searches. Let's say you want to search on, terrorism or whatever words that, you think they might be using in their terror group. If you can find that quicker and you can pass it on to the investigator, you're better off.
Well, and the thing that you just said, and Mary and Lodrina have also mentioned, is that the process helps you out, and your depth of knowledge in an area. Jeff, when you're going to YouTube, you're not just watching all, hundreds of hours of videos. What you said is that you, and I'm inferring here, you have a process by which you use the YouTube DL downloading application to download those videos from YouTube to preserve them, one, in case they get deleted or removed by YouTube's terms of service. And then you also have methods to go through them faster. I was just watching Twitter the other day, and a person was like, hey, you can't actually, no, this was in a separate talk. Somebody mentioned looking at the transcripts of the transcripts of the YouTube videos and parsing that for full keywords. I think that was my buddy Griffin. And I mean, it's just amazing that you have to understand the platform, but you also have to understand how to preserve the data and how to search through it rapidly enough that you're not watching 600 hours of video.
What's your favorite?
Go ahead.
And so I just wanted to follow up on somebody else's question. So we talk about tools and about something, whether it's admissible or not. And it's, well, listening isn't a forensic tool. Well, that's true. It's, EXIF tool, which is the command line tool for looking at metadata, is not a forensic tool. You can make changes to it. Yeah. It's the process in which you do these things that's where it becomes forensic. It's you that makes this forensic, not the tool always.
Okay. So my favorite, it's really not an OSINT or a cyber thing. It's when, I think it was in NCIS, where they have 4 hands on one keyboard, and like one person's like, oh, they're breaking through the firewall, and somebody else comes and joins her and starts typing there too. Like, yeah, that happens. And my family's like, wow, they're so efficient. I'm like, no, that's not how things work. That's not how any of this works. Lo, what about you? Do you have a favorite example of those television movie things for forensics?
I've got to shout out a really good example of somebody who did forensics right on the screen. And they did it so right, I feel like there's got to be a forensic consultant for this TV show. And I want to know who it is, because you did a great job, whoever it is. If anyone's a fan of Brooklyn Nine-Nine, really great comedic kind of buddy cop show. There's one scene where Captain Holt, who's a very stiff upper lip, obscure knowledge kind of guy, goes to the Barrel Museum, and he's really into barrels.
Like,
yes,
barrels
those big round.
Okay.
Yeah.
Barrels.
So, barrels at the Barrel Museum.
Of course.
And there's a whole episode that develops around, like, these people go to the Barrel Museum, and he is trying to talk about different types of wood and aging methods and these historically important barrels, while another cop is in the back room imaging for hours. He's like, oh, please talk more about barrels because my forensic image is not done yet. And just, there's hours of plot development around he's sitting there waiting for the status bar to be like, I'm copying data. So I want to give one shout out to Brooklyn Nine-Nine, because I think they did a great job.
For accurately representing the wonderful world of waiting. Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, and with the devices now, well, and I would imagine, and this is just me as a outsider to the digital forensics world, with devices now being hosted on cloud storage and with hard drives getting bigger, and now the M2 flash media, with all of that, I mean, it has to be even more challenging to wait for an image to be captured on some remote cloud instance and then download that, gigs of data. And it might be even more challenging. All right. So, other questions for the things that you all get, the artifacts. You might find. I think Mary, you were talking about like process names and applications. Lo, you were mentioning other things like maybe the wireless network. Do you all have favorite resources, or how do you find those resources? Because I mean, there are places out there like osintframework.com and technazet.com and osintframework.de, which have a huge number of websites that you can go to look up users and files and all. But is there a digital forensics like best place that's a one-stop shop for all these things? Anybody? No, not yet. Okay.
No, it's not all centralized. At least that's been my experience. It's a handful of tools that I go to, or people that I reach out to. Being a manager, sometimes I get to delegate some of these things. But I think, some interesting things we've seen in the past too, like pastebin gets used sometimes for a lot of things. And we had a case where an attacker compromised a bunch of companies, and they actually kept that list up on pastebin. So through some, keen Googling by some coworkers, they were able to discover this list, and they archived it and they saved it off. But I think VirusTotal is one that I actually hit quite a bit, just checking hash values of files that are found. So, kind of skipping that step of maybe doing malware analysis. And, I use VirusTotal, DNS tools, things like that all the time.
Okay. Jeff, thoughts?
I mean, we all use kind of the same tools for different reasons. I have my other job is, to also kind of teach the people that I work with about, the dangers that are out there. Let's say you're going through a particular a dump that someone's given you either from a phone or from a computer, and you want to check out a website or you want to see if that's related to something. And so one of the easiest tools that I always recommend and I use myself every day is urlscan.io.
urlscan.io.
Yeah, and it is because it's, well, one, it's safe because it's a proxy. You can look at a screenshot of the thing. It's not your system actually going to it. And the other side is, if, let's say in a fraud situation where if this is a site that someone's just basically replicated and they're using multiple times, or it's being used within the same infrastructure, that URL scan does that really quickly as far as showing you the sites. So I've had situations where somebody sent their Bitcoin to something and they were going to get 10 times the amount they were going to get back. They got this great tip off of the internet somewhere. And then I'll go to the site and I go, indeed, it is still up. And then I'll look at some other ones and they look exactly like, so URL scan will find those immediately. So now I not only have just one lead, I have maybe 4 or 5 leads, and I can start putting these together. And most of the time it's organized crime, people putting these things together. And we can find these answers really quickly, just little tools like that. But again, understanding not only from a forensic standpoint, if that was in a victim's machine or something like that, but what does that mean on the outside as far as the relationships?
So one of the common threads that we've all been mentioning is about investigations. We've all used that word, investigations, whether you're looking into dead computers, mobile devices, or trying to find the bad guys that are in a network. Can you tell me, each of you has your own probably methodology, your own processes, but you also have your own investigative mindset that you use, right? And one of the things that I find about open source intelligence is, yeah, we have tools. Yes, we have websites and all of those things. But the people that I know that are most successful have tenacity, and they also have that investigative mindset that allows them to continue to look and then find this one bit of data and then pivot to another thing. Do you all find that you all have that, and your students and your coworkers have that too?
Yes,
Yeah.
I think spouses recognize that too, you know, because we're constantly drilling them with questions for more information on things, right?
Yeah.
And the kids, right? I definitely would agree with that. You can have tools that as an investigator, you know, I was talking about that case example earlier where, you know, the name just stuck out to me as being a little bit different. So a lot of times it's being able to recognize patterns or differences in patterns or kind of picking up on something, you know, your spidey senses just kind of go off, right? Like something's not quite right here. And I think that the tools are easy to learn, not easy to learn, but that's teachable. I think that investigative mindset can be that missing piece sometimes that, you know, people that are in this field love it. Lo, I saw you earlier smiling about all of your findings. I mean, really, our best findings are usually the worst for our clients when we're doing it, but it makes us really happy as investigators to see those puzzle pieces start to come together as the story gets to be built out.
Cool.
Yeah, and Mary, you talked about puzzle pieces. I feel like that's such a good theme to put this together. You know, the work that we do and getting that spidey sense is not something that any AI or machine learning is going to put together for us, at least today. You know, there's still something very human about investigations. And, you know, we need more people in the field who are interested in this kind of stuff. Yeah. As far as investigations, I just happen, outside of my work life, I happen to be really interested in investigative type stories. So during the past year when I was locked down at home, I read for the first time all of the Sherlock Holmes mysteries.
Oh, so like like fiction like stories. Okay.
Oh yeah, but you know, it's a different way of getting those creative juices flowing, and you know, even things that seem to be not at all related to technology. Yeah. Anything that expands your thinking and your worldview, and we could expand that to reading the news and beyond that. You know, can really help you, I think, in both of our fields.
Yeah. And Jeff, I mean, I would imagine with a lot of the crime-based investigations that you're doing, things that happened in the news or will happen on the news play an essential part of understanding what's happening or what could have happened. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, it's like an investigative mindset is very, in my experience, is a very difficult thing to teach. Probably more so difficult to teach than, say, you know, forensics, because we can write something in forensics down. We can, you know, show people where artifacts are at, and we can train those things. But to get that mindset is, you know, it comes from inside. And like you mentioned before, Lodrina, I think you mentioned, is that the machines can't do that yet. That's where we excel at. And so whenever I talk, you know, to people, you know, within my office or anything, and they said, you know, how can I get better at this? And it's just, well, it's within you. You have to be the one that are out there looking for the answers. And of course, the more you get experience in, you know, how to find those answers, say things like OSINT, things like that, it just makes you a better whatever it is, whether it's an investigator or whether it's a digital forensic examiner. It makes you better at those things. I mean, you have to be an expert in OSINT? No, I mean, if you want to, but it does make you better in many different ways.
Well, and Lodrina, you brought up the point about how having that world experience outside of your chosen field can augment your analysis and your decision making within your field. I find that absolutely to be the case. You know, just the more curious I am about the world, the websites I visit, or you know, hey, this new social media site popped up. Let me just go get a count on there and just see what data can be found, what data is protected. Just playing around with things and exploring this world is something that's really helpful, because you never know when you're going to need that information, or you're going to remember, hey, you know, Sherlock found this one feather, and that feather was from a bird that only flew east to west, or whatever it happens to be. So I absolutely agree with you there. Now, was there anything in your reading of Sherlock Holmes that stood out to you that you're like, aha, if I'd only remembered this on a case?
Oh, man. You know, the thing that stuck out to me in hindsight is that I was so excited that in a group of must have been around 40 or 50 mysteries, you know, and I had this little trade paperback version. So the books are like this thick. Out of all of those, I remember there was one that I solved, or, you know, saw the conclusion of right near the beginning. And I was so proud of myself for that, because it came as I was, you know, 90% of the way through all of the stories. But it took that long for me to really like see how the stories were built, figure out what clues were important, and kind of take an educated guess at where it was going.
Wow.
So, you know, I
that's
think
experience,
it
right?
takes practice.
Well, that's exactly the point, is that you put in all of the hours to get to the point where you got good enough that you could determine the outcome relatively safely with, you know, at the beginning. And that's incredible. You trained yourself there. You learned and you got better. So well done. Are you going to write any books for us? Any Sherlock Holmes kind of knockoffs?
Ooh, stay tuned.
With a D for Brooklyn Nine-Nine slant. I want to see it. Yeah, it'll happen. All right. Well, I think we could probably go on here for hours, but I know that we're coming up on time here, and I just wanted to take a minute to thank each of you for sharing an hour of your time with us and with our wonderful communities out there. Mari, thank you for being on the show. And Jeff, thank you for being on the show as well. And Lodrina, thank you. And thank you to our wonderful audience that has been sending in all these wonderful comments that we've just surreptitiously been adding to our conversation. Thank you for help guiding us and for being out there, helping us out there in the world. We are going to let you know about this next Open Source Intelligence Plus. It's going to be on July 26th, and it'll be about OSINT plus security awareness. So spread the word on that. You'll be getting more. Please follow the SANS Cyber Defense Twitter account and join those many resources that my colleague Stephen has been adding to the chat. With that, everybody, thank you very much for coming. Thank you to our audience, and stay OSINT curious, everybody.